The magazine of fantasy and science fiction emphasized literary quality, style. The mere fact that they had the word fantasy in the title showed they were less interested in strict science fiction. Horace Gold was interested more in the reaction to scientific advance than to the scientific advance itself, which made, in some cases, for more sophisticated stories. These were not Campbell-type stories. Once again, the center of interest had moved away from scientists themselves towards society.
You're listening to Canary Cry Radio. Now here are your hosts, Basil and Gons.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Canary Cry Radio. My name is Gons. Basil might phone in. He's somewhere in the Midwest, somewhere in some place and time out there. So if he figures out a way to call in, we will definitely welcome him into the conversation. But tonight we have this very special guest. He is a professional filmmaker, a writer, and designer for over 20 years. He's an award-winning screenwriter. His first feature film was To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland. But he's also written other feature films, documentaries, and promotional videos. And Brian's also an author and international speaker on art, movies, worldviews, and faith. He's the author of the Chronicles of the Nephilim series, and Book 1, Noah Primeval, and Book 2, Enoch Primeval, Book 3, Gilgamesh Immortal are out, and we are eagerly anticipating Abraham Allegiant, which is the next in the series. And he was kind enough to send me a copy of a book called Myth Became Fact, Storytelling, Imagination, and Apologetics in the Bible. It's Brian Godawa. How you doing, Brian?
Well, pretty good, Gons. What are we going to talk about with all that stuff?
I don't know. There's a lot to tackle. I have an idea, an outline of what I want to talk about. But basically, the first thing I want to tackle with you is in the last podcast that we posted, I mentioned that I think there's going to be somewhat of a revival or maybe a renewed interest in the Bible, especially in the Christian institutions, based on a lot of the research coming out on the Nephilim. And really, we're talking about the Divine Council and Dr. Michael Heiser. And we spoke to him a few episodes ago. And so, but, right now we're experiencing a little bit of backlash. And I know that firsthand because we've tried to do conferences at various places and we've been turned down and things of that nature. So do you think there's actually going to be a rise of interest in this topic? And how does it relate to your work writing the Chronicles of the Nephilim series?
Sure. Yeah. No, I actually think that we are in the midst of a kind of a transformation in the Christian church. And I think it's tied to the inevitable awareness that we are going to have to become more aware of the ancient Near Eastern context and background of the Bible. That's where I think the primary transformation is occurring, in that more and more Christians are starting to say, hey, I think this is what the Bible says, but, what did the ancient Israelites, what was their culture like? We read so many different weird things in the Bible that kind of don't make sense, and we think we can make sense of them, but a lot of them we can't. And even some things we do think make sense, they understood it so differently back in that time period that we don't realize that unless we do research into finding out all this Bible background. So, and I think that it was triggered by liberal critical theology, which basically, many years ago at the turn of the century, there was the attempt to try to sort of explain that the Bible was just myths, made up fairy tales, and they did do research into ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, but they also started criticizing the biblical text and trying to deconstruct it, basically, and explain that it's really not what it says it is or what it appears to be. But if we look back into the various sources and we look back into whatever, and they constructed actually fantasy theories of how the Bible was put together artificially. It wasn't just written by Moses or what have you. And I'm not what what I think is happening is there was a reaction against that by fundamentalism, and it sort of said, oh, no, they're all wrong, so we're just going to believe what the Bible says straight up and literally. And by doing so, the evangelicals back themselves into a terrible corner that is not ultimately defensible, because there is, even if you disagree with the conclusions of critical theology that does try to undermine the Bible, there is still a lot of truths in the facts that they may uncover. It's just their interpretations that are twisted by their presuppositions. So what I'm saying is, because of the whole sort of current cultural climate I think in America and in Christianity as well, I think that there's more of an attempt to understand that cultural context, how they would understand it, not how we would understand it. And in so doing, and I feel like I'm in the midst of that myself, because in the last 5 years or 6 years, I've gone through that journey myself, where I've sort of started realizing, hey, wait a minute, the way that I would read it may not be how it was meant. So let's find out how they thought. And I think that that's the heart of it. And then part of that, what part of that comes in is the whole giants and the Nephilim and like you said, the divine council. And Michael Heiser also was very extremely influential on me. In fact, it was his writing that opened me up to the whole storyline of giants in the Bible that I really was only vaguely aware of and didn't think it made much sense. But then I saw the storyline, and once I saw the storyline, I realized, oh my gosh, I've got to write the novels. And that's what sort of inspired me to write the novels. But the whole context of the divine council and how that operates, and basically it's very, very similar to an ancient Mesopotamian bureaucracy in heaven, and the heavenly host and how God interacts with them and such. The way to understand it, if you understand the ancient Near Eastern version of that divine council, because pretty much all the religions had that version in it, then you begin understanding the Bible. But if you don't have that and you just read the Bible straight, as an evangelical, you'll tend to try to change the definitions of sons of God. Oh, they're earthly judges. It's the Israelite judges who are like gods to men because they rule over them. And basically what you end up doing is you end up imposing your own cultural prejudice upon the text in the name of trying to save the literal reading of it. Here's the problem, is that when the evangelicals threw out the baby with the bathwater, what they did was they rightfully rejected the conclusion of critical scholarship that the Bible's just made up fairy tales and it's not true. But they threw out a lot of the facts, and when they did that, they backed themselves into a corner. So now we're at this point where the stuff, because we now, even 100 years later, we now have so much, literally thousands of ancient manuscripts that we never had 100 years ago, that we now do understand the background of the Bible much more than we did 100 years ago. And it's clarifying a lot of things that we didn't know. And if you don't acknowledge that, you are going to become not only irrelevant in the negative sense, but you also are going to miss the scriptural truths that are being revealed, and you are going to become basically a foolish Christian with your head stuck in the sand saying, no, I read Genesis 1 literally because that's what God said. It's literal. And it's like, oh no, you do the research. And my conclusion is the options are not, you either believe the Bible literally or you believe it's all myth and fairy tale and therefore you don't believe the Bible. No. In between, there's this ability to realize that the Bible is full of different genres of literature, and genres have certain things that, just like our fantasy literature nowadays has some conventions and formulas, or just like a horror story, or just like a love story, we have these conventions of things that we use in our language, so they did too. And you start to discover that a lot of the language in the Bible is a lot more figurative than Christians want to admit. But that doesn't mean it's liberal. That doesn't mean you're saying, oh, the Bible's not true. It just simply means they did it like we did it. So, for example, you have things like the language in Joshua entering Canaan, the promised land, and he talks about how, we killed every man, woman, and child in these different cities, But then within the Bible text itself, we see right after these passages that they didn't kill everybody, because it talks about people from that city still being alive.
Right.
And so so the liberal then says, see, the Bible contradicts itself. And I'm saying, no, you don't have to come to that conclusion. If you realize, oh, wait a minute, this kind of extreme language was used by all military endeavors in the ancient world. You can find it in Assyria, you can find it in Mesopotamia, you can find it in texts from Ugarit. And once you realize that they all said we killed them all and slaughtered them all, but they didn't, you realize that's part of their puffing up their own, how can you say it, their own public relations, and it was very standard to do that. And they understood that. Just like nowadays we might say, the football team,
Right.
Pick your football team. They slaughtered the enemy, right?
Right.
Well, they didn't slaughter them, right? So the more you start to see this kind of stuff is in the Bible, the more you start to read it through their eyes and not our eyes, and you start to realize that a lot of what we thought was just good old, reading the Bible on the plain face of it, actually is our own modernist Christian Western prejudice imposed on the text. And that's ultimately liberalism.
Right.
So that's the big picture thing that sort of launched me. And once I started to read the Divine Council, I realized, you know what, the Divine Council and all the language of the sons of God throughout the text, it really is a divine bureaucracy, and it has nothing to do with human judges on earth, because it's the same way that it's interpreted in all the ancient Near Eastern cultures. And then that's where it opened up the picture to me, the storyline of the Nephilim, because that's where Genesis 6 comes in as being, for me personally, that was always Genesis 6, 1-4, where it talks about the sons of God came to earth and saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they mated with them, and they bore, and they had Nephilim were in the earth in those days, et cetera, et cetera. And Nephilim, of course, is the Hebrew Aramaic word for giants. And so I had always known that passage and just considered it one of the weirdest passages in the Bible. But then when I started reading Heiser and he kind of opened up the story, I started realizing, oh my gosh, this isn't just an obscure passage that talks about maybe there was giants, but that's about it. This is connected to a whole storyline that is connected to the seed of the serpent at war with the seed of Eve, or the seed of the woman, through history. And then I started seeing all these other sporadic little passages that I would just read and say, oh, so-and-so killed this giant, and so-and-so killed that giant. And you're like, oh, okay, whatever. Right. And we all of course know Goliath. But then something I never realized in these passages in Joshua really talks about how Joshua was deliberately seeking out the cities that had giants to eliminate them. Right. And you're like, wow, so this storyline that comes alive by realizing that this passage in Genesis 6, 1-4 is not just some bizarre mythological referent, because all the ancient religions talked about giants. No. But it's also not just this obscure reference that has no connection to anything else, like it seems to be when you start to put the connections and you see it throughout the scriptures and you start to see that storyline. That was the inspiration that fired me up for the Chronicles of the Nephilim.
Yeah, and I share a lot of the aha moments when you start reading through the Old Testament through sort of the Divine Council lens, and we've talked about that in the past. But it seems like the church, you put it well, that they sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater, in the last 150 years or so, as materialism or reductionism became sort of the platform for any accredited truth, right? And science sort of championed it. It seems it's interesting to me when we start looking at scientists today who are pretty much imposing philosophical views and cosmological views that they really have no business doing. And I would say that in some sense, what the standard Christian apologetic that we receive today, or what we're taught today, are very much rooted in that logic, reason, empiricism, and looking at history and things, and which is great. I think it's totally necessary.
Yes.
But it's the same tools almost that the materialist worldview uses. But in the pursuit of defending the gospel, how important do you think storytelling, imagery, things of that nature is? Because I think you mentioned in the book you sent me early on, you said that 80% of the Bible is imagery, symbolism, metaphor, poetic, figurative language, and only 20% is actual abstract logical propositions. So how do we shift that thinking as a church body?
Yeah, that's a really big issue, and I think that in my book Word Pictures was my first book that I started to deal with that whole issue, and that was once you start realizing that so what I like what you were saying, and this idea was that many Christians are unwittingly operating under the same paradigm as atheistic, secular thinking, all in the name of evangelicalism,
right?
Because this, and I'm as conservative as it comes in terms of theologically. So I'm not a liberal. I'm not a postmodern. I don't believe in the postmodern Christian church, But I'm not a modernist. And what many Christians don't realize is that when they use their strictly literalist paradigm, reading the Bible literally all the time with everything, and I'm not saying it's either or here. My point is the either or mentality is precisely modernism. So you are doing the same thing the atheist does when he comes to the Bible and he says it's either interpreted this way or it's all wrong interpreted this way. And so once you start to realizing that there is so much imagination in the Bible, and what you realize is imagination and C.S. Lewis talked a lot about this, and he had his own journey of revelation in this area. Imagination is not the same as the clear, cut and dry, phenomenal interpretation of your empirical senses, which is science, or your rationalistic impulse, which is, a reason and rationalism. And like you said, those are the tools of the Enlightenment. Now, they're not evil tools, and they're not entirely wrong, but when they are elevated to the primary or ultimate position that Christians have given them. So, yes, we must defend the Bible to be absolutely empirically true and scientifically true and all this kind of stuff as we understand it, right? When you do that, you are actually imposing the same atheistic paradigm on the Bible, because God himself in the Bible uses those notions of, empirical senses and rational thinking very little. I'm not saying he doesn't use it, and I fully support that he does. God says, come and let us reason, says the Lord. And I say this in Word Pictures. I validate the fact that God is logical and God uses reason. However, logic, reason, and observation, science, are not the ultimates when it comes to knowing truth. They're just one form of knowing truth.
Right.
But we have neglected imagination. Now, imagination is not, it's a lot murkier. It's a lot more ambiguous. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it doesn't, for those of us, and I've studied apologetics for like 25 years, and much of my life was driven by apologetics because I love it, logic, reason, philosophy, all that. And I still do love it. But when I came to realize that those were becoming almost idols of perception in my life in terms of discerning truth through that. And I completely lost the imaginative side in my theology. And I never did as an artist, but I did in my theology when I read the Bible. And why? Because if you start to say that, if you start to approach the Bible from the imagination side, things are not black and white. There's a lot more gray area. There's a lot more, and I'm not talking necessarily morally here. I'm just simply saying in terms of understanding its truth, it's a lot messier. Why? Because the Bible is not a systematic theology. Systematic theology basically organizes according to a scientific paradigm. That's not ancient. That's not the ancient way of doing things. I'm not saying it's wrong. But what I am saying is it's not the way the Bible did it. Therefore, the Bible does not have the clarity of modern science. It uses story to communicate theology, not the scientific or philosophical discourse. And so because it does, in some areas it does, obviously there's historical elements, there are some philosophical elements, because the Bible's a mishmash of a lot of different genres, but it's not this one unified book of doctrine that is scientific, that's kind of a thing. So because its dominant paradigm is through storytelling, then you have to understand, how does storytelling communicate truth? And that's where you have to say, the way storytelling communicates truth is a lot more ambiguous at times because they use a lot more poetic language. They use a lot more figurative language. There's a lot more exaggeration. There's hyperbole. And it's all mixed in with, unfortunately, a lot of times it's mixed in with history and with it mixed in with logic.
Right.
And so you'll have, all over the place, a prophecy. And the prophecy, and then we're talking about the Old Testament here for starters, but you could go into Revelation too, the book of Revelation. But, there's all kinds of obvious figurative language like, when Sisera came and fought against Israel, the Israelites, there's a passage where it says, the stars of heaven fought against Sisera, and you're like, what does that mean? And then it shifts back to historical descriptions of how Israel conquered Sisera in this battle. And so what I'm saying is, it is historical, but unfortunately, it also meshes in a lot of poetry. So you have to study to show yourself approved. You have to be able to accurately pick apart what these meanings are and what is history and what's figurative and what's exaggeration, what isn't. And that's the thing that's hard. People don't like that because that makes it real. It makes it not black and white. If you could just say, nope, the Bible says God created on 7 days. So if you don't believe in several literal days, you don't believe the Bible. Well, that's a lot easier to just say that than to say, well, you know what? There are literal days, but it doesn't really match the what we know about our observations in science. And we also look at the creation narratives of other ancient Near Eastern cultures, and we find them very similar, saying a lot of similar things and doing a lot of similar things. And we realize that it's not scientific at all. And so, rather than thinking you either believe Genesis 1 is literal or you're a liberal, no. Both sides are liberal that say Genesis 1 must be scientific. And one side says it must be scientific, it must be literal 6 days, and the other says, no, they could be figurative days, but they still match our science. Both sides are actually imposing a modernist paradigm, because in reality, ancient creation narratives had nothing to do with what we know of modern science. Therefore, it's not speaking about the physical creation of the world of physics and the quantum world and all this kind of stuff. It's not talking about that. And once you understand that, that's not liberal at all. That's actually the most conservative viewpoint, because you're interpreting the Bible as it was intended to be interpreted by its original writers and readers. And the liberal approach is actually to say the Bible this is my argument. The liberal approach is when you say the Bible must conform to modern scientific theories of the way that the world was created, because it's like you're imposing your own modern world upon an ancient text.
Right.
And that in my mind is what's liberal. So this is the problem, where Christians are just afraid of the slippery slope. If I start looking at the imagination in the Bible and all the figurative and poetic language and start embracing this, I'm going to slide down the slippery slope, and in the end, I'll just think the whole Bible is nothing but myth. And that's not true. That's just simply not true.
Right. Piggybacking on that question and answer there, is there, do you have any examples where, especially looking at some Old Testament passages, that the whole sort of paradigm of the Nephilim and the Genesis 6 paradigm, I guess you can call it can be used to help understand some of it? And I know you mentioned already Joshua. Is there any other examples? Because it seems like, I'm just having a hard time picturing your standard apologetic course, any kind of Christian institution bring up the Nephilim as part of your argument, to defend some of these verses. So are there more examples that you can think of just off the top of your head?
Well, yeah, there's one passage that I've just been dealing with, which is a passage in the Bible that is one of those surprises where you understand it in this context and all of a sudden it's different.
Right.
And it's Genesis 14. Genesis 14 is a passage where it talks about Abram at the time, rescuing his nephew Lot, who was taken by these 4 armies from Mesopotamia who came and swept through the land, and then they ending up at Sodom and Gomorrah, and the reason why they came was because they weren't paying their taxes. And so anyway, Lot gets captured because he was living at Sodom at the time, and this armies came and they beat up Sodom, and they took a bunch of captives, including Lot, and took the booty, and they were on their way back to Mesopotamia. And Abram discovers that, oh my gosh, they took my nephew, and so he leads an army. He leads armed forces that include several other Amorite tribes who were helping him, as well as 318 of his own warriors, to go and capture Lot back from this army that no doubt had tens of thousands of men in it, right? And this is one of these passages that I just have been dealing with it because I just finished my most recent book in the series called Abraham Allegiant, and it should be released at the 1st of April, and I'm going to have a big release for it and stuff. So April 1, it should be available. And so this passage, we always think of Abraham as, oh yeah, Abraham's this nice pastoral guy with his sheep, and he gets the call of God. And, but actually Genesis 14 reveals that he was a warrior. And this doesn't fit our paradigm, number one. And it's like, oh yeah, but that's just one passage, Brian. You can't form a doctrine based on one passage. Well, the problem is of all of Abraham's 100 years of life in the Bible, it only touches upon a few incidents here and there. So it leaves out most of his life. So it's leaving out a lot of stuff. And so, yeah, I can say if there's one passage that reveals he's a warrior, then we have to conclude, yeah, he was a warrior, and it's okay to believe that doctrine. But that's just the start of it, because the bottom line is when you read that passage, you find that it in standard sort of historical approach, it describes these four kings from Mesopotamia coming through and hitting these certain cities in Canaan before they ended up at Sodom and Gomorrah. And all these cities, it mentions these characters called Rephaim, Zuzim, Emim, Horites, and they're saying that they basically took all these cities and wiped them out before they ended up at Sodom and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah was their ultimate purpose in the first place. And if you look on a map and you see their journey of where they ended up, it was a really out-of-the-way journey. And when you look up what these words Emim and Zuzim and Horites and Rephaim mean, you counter them to other passages in the Bible, get a standard concordance, look up those words in the Bible, you find out that all of these are different words of giants in these different cities. And what you start to see is there's a pattern in these kings. They're literally hitting cities that have giants in them. And why would they do that? What is their purpose? Well, I think the answer of it is these cities were along the King's Highway. And the King's Highway was this major traveled route from north to south through the land of Canaan. And it was the dominant access for trade from the north in Syria and the Euphrates River way down to the south in Egypt. It was a key highway for trade. And these giant cities some of them were along that road, but some of them weren't. But basically, I think that and this is speculation now, but it's rooted in the text. And that is, these kings knew that they had to take out these mightier cities in order to subjugate the region and claim that highway to make it free and open for trade. And they had to specifically take out the giants because those were the guys who seemed to be having control over the land. And they took them out before they ended up at Sodom and Gomorrah, which was their ultimate end goal. So in my novel, Abraham Allegiant, I actually have a much more developed, very fascinating theory behind what's going on at Sodom and Gomorrah that makes it so important, and why are these giants connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. And you'll just have to buy the new book to find out what that is. But that's just one example where it mentions cities and it mentions these giants, but it doesn't say anything about it. But you have to see the pattern and the connection, and then you start to see that same connection ends up later in the book of Joshua and the book of Numbers.
Right. Yeah,
where Moses and Joshua, before they go into the promised land, they have to take the Transjordan, which is on the other side of the Jordan River. It's not part of the promised land, but they have to take out all the giants there before they go into the promised land and take out the giants in the promised land. But the thing is they're specifically targeting these giants. And then when they go into the promised land, it talks about the Anakim. And the Anakim are basically, it says they're giants and they come from the Nephilim. And then you say, and it's the only other place in the Bible is Numbers 13, verse 32 and 33. The only other place that the word Nephilim is used, other than Genesis 6, is there. And it says that that the Anakim, if I can, well, maybe I should find it here. And Numbers 13:33, which says, this is the spies. The spies came back to report to Moses that the land which we have gone to spy out in Canaan is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw, the Nephilim. And then it says the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. We seemed like ourselves, like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And so you start to think, okay, so they're giants, so what? But there's this very interesting notion here. It's saying that these Anakim, which is another word for a certain strong, large tribe of people, sons of Anak, and they come from the Nephilim. Well, the Nephilim were before the flood. So that becomes problematic for your theology if you believe in a global flood. But if you don't believe in global flood, there's still some issues that you have to deal with. But the problem here is they come from the Nephilim. I thought everything was wiped out. All the bad guys were wiped out in the flood.
That was part of my next question, was what your theory is on how the Nephilim returned, and is it weaved into the Chronicles of Nephilim, and how do you actually...
It is weaved in the Chronicles of Nephilim, but I also respect the fact that within Orthodox Christianity, there are different interpretations that are all possible and legitimate. And I try to write the novel series so that any view that you have, you could still sort of...
Hang on one second. This is what I was afraid of.
Hello?
What's up?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't think you can hear me, though.
I hear something. Howdy, how's it going, Brian?
Hey, Basil, how are you?
You know, I'm doing the best I can. I'm out in the middle of the U.S. here and trying to get my internet to work, and we're going to try the best we can, but we'll see what happens here. Well, you guys could excuse me for just one moment.
That moment turned into several moments, and we couldn't get a clean connection with Basil, so Basil decided to come back later, but we continued the conversation with Brian. But before we get back to that, check this out.
In the primeval history of Genesis, an ancient war began between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Fallen angels called Watchers begot a race of giants called Nephilim, their goal: to stop the bloodline of the promised seed. But God had other plans. Chronicles of the Nephilim is a biblical fantasy series of novels that charts the rise and fall of the Watchers and the giants in the stories of the Old Testament and in between. Noah Primeval, Enoch Primordial, Gilgamesh Immortal, Abraham Covenant, and more to come, by author and Hollywood screenwriter Brian Godawa. Available on Kindle and paperback at Amazon.com. Go to chroniclesofthenephilim.com and enter a world of ancient history and biblical imagination. That's chroniclesofthenephilim.com.
Okay, that was a failed attempt. He might try a little later. He's going to try to find not Applebee's to get some internet connection. So I apologize for that. It's very unprofessional. Okay, I'm sorry. We were. What was the question I asked?
Well, another one, in addition to the Genesis 14 one that I mentioned, would be in Numbers 13, 32 and 33, where which is a very key verse in terms of understanding how the divine counsel and the Nephilim applies to understanding the Old Testament text differently than normal. Because in those two verses, this is just to set the stage. We have basically Moses and Joshua are, they're they're near the Transjordan. I think they're in the Transjordan area, but they send spies ahead to go into Canaan to spy out the land. And the spies come back to them, and this is what they say. They say, the land, though the land through which we have gone to spy it out, is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Now, this is obviously talking about people of great height, and you look elsewhere in the Bible where it talks about the sons of Anak and the Anakim, and it very clearly says these guys are giants, and some of them are really tall and really huge, right? And so they're talking that they see a lot of these giants in the land. And on one level, you could say, okay, fine, fair enough, I accept that. And they come and they killed some of those guys because they were big and they needed to clear out the land for the sons of Israel, yada, yada. But there's something very interesting here, and that is this verse is the only other place in the Bible where the word Nephilim is actually used. And if we go back to the Genesis 6, we say, oh, well, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and the Nephilim come about from the sons of God cohabiting with the daughters of men. And I think that one of the strongest interpretations of the Hebrew there is that these giants are the result of the cohabitation of the sons of God from heaven with the daughters of men. So if you understand that and accept that, then you have to say, okay, but in the flood, didn't the flood wipe out all living things? And if the Nephilim were living back then, and now it says the Nephilim 1,000 years later during the time of Joshua,
right.
What? These guys came from the Nephilim, and then that means Nephilim survived the flood. So now you have to say, well, what does that mean? Oh, the Bible's myth and it contradicts itself? No. What you have to realize is there's several ways of interpreting this, and all of them are legitimate within the Orthodox Christianity. There are several ways of interpreting it. In my novels, I try to actually write it in such a way that each viewpoint can find their own interpretation there, because I'm not sure. And at the end of the day, I could be wrong, right? So let me explain. If you believe the flood is global and killed everything, then either you have to believe that the sons of God started to cohabit again with the daughters of men, and that's where they came from, or you have to believe that there's some genetic strain of Nephilim in one of the daughters in one of the wives of the sons of Noah, because they were the only 8 in the ark, right? And basically the Bible says Noah was pure in his generation, and the language of that has a sense of ritual purity to it, and a Levitical type of purity. So it's probably a genetic purity, especially in light of the context of Genesis 6.
Right.
And so if Noah was pure and his wife was pure and his sons then ended up being logically pure, then it would have to be in one of the wives, that there was a genetic strain of some kind of the Nephilim. And all these are legitimate. Or, lastly, you could believe that, and there are legitimate Bible-believing Christians who believe that the flood was not global. It was local, and the language there is hyperbolic, and a lot of it, we misinterpret it through our literal eyes. So these are all legitimate interpretations within Orthodox Christianity. And like I said, in my novel series, I try to make room for all the views so that people can appreciate it no matter what you believe. But here's what's important. These Nephilim were part of the cause, connected to the cause in Genesis 6, why God brought the flood. Yes, God did bring the flood because of man's sinful nature, but it also says that the land, all the flesh was filled with violence, and the Nephilim were part of that flesh that was filled with violence. So they are a part of that sin that God brought down the judgment of the flood. And so now if you're saying that these current giants come from them, well, there's a connection here in the mind of the Israelites that's going on, which basically connects them to being that evil seed, because that was part of the evil seed that God wanted to wipe out, and it never fully got wiped out. And I actually do appreciate. I think on one of your last shows, I think it was. Did I hear it on? Yeah, I Rob Skiba, and I've read a little bit of his, and I appreciate some of his theories about how he thinks that, biblically, that there's not actually. I think he makes some good arguments. Let's say I don't think they're entirely conclusive, but I think he makes some good arguments for that. There may not have been any more sons of God cohabiting with the daughters of men after the flood.
Right.
I think that there was, and I bring up my theory based on, and its interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah, but I could talk about that later. But so what's important here is that these sons of Anak are tied to the Nephilim, and that's, you can already see there's a theological pinning coming in that connects these together, but it also shows that God's not finished wiping them out yet, and he's going to use the Israelites to wipe them out. And then in Joshua later, where you see that Joshua specifically targets the Anakim, he says, I went through all these cities, and what in Joshua 11, and it says, and I got rid of the Anakim in all these cities. So Joshua is deliberately wiping out the Nephilim, who are connected back to those pre-flood guys, and they're all described as giants. So in other words, there was part of the plan of wiping out the people of the land of Canaan was not just to clear it so God could take it. There's an evilness to these people there, and I think it's dominantly connected to their religious, the religious system, obviously, of idol worship and all that. But nevertheless, there's this seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman theme that, or meme, as we now call it, right? That is actually replaying itself out, and that's one other case where I think you could say, oh, there's a lot more to this passage than just saying, oh, there's giants in the land, let's go kill them.
Right. Yeah, and actually looking, Numbers 13:33 was something I recently looked at, I think yesterday or maybe the day before, because the argument against this idea that there are Nephilim at all in the post-flood world is, because a lot of people bring up Numbers 13:33 as sort of a defense of like, hey, they mentioned the Nephilim, the giants here, But if you read on to Numbers 14 in the next chapter, God actually puts to death the men who actually brought the bad report. The bad report in Hebrew, I can't remember the Hebrew word for it, but it basically could mean slander. And so the argument is, look, it's slanderous. They didn't actually mean giants. They were just trying to scare the Israelites or the rest of the Israelite tribes to not have to go into those lands when, Caleb was saying that, it's the land of milk and honey and things like that. And I kind of struggled with that, but I feel like I came to a point where both can still be true. Yes, they were actual giants, but it was the use of the excuse, if you will, that there are giants and therefore we shouldn't go in, that the Lord was upset about and therefore put him to death. So I don't know. Have you looked at that sort of?
Yeah, and I've actually read some Hebrew scholars as well, and they've like in the word commentary series, Gordon Wenham, he's brilliant, and other Hebrew scholars who actually point out that that the bad report is not saying that they're lying or slandering. They're just saying they're saying that the report was a report of negativity. We can't do it, So I think there are scholars on the other side that actually do support the notion that no, this idea of saying it's a bad report is not that they're lying, or not saying the truth. It's that they're actually saying these guys are big, so we can't do it.
Right.
And that's why they were killed, because Joshua doesn't deny it, Caleb doesn't deny it, and those guys are righteous men.
Right.
They don't deny that there's giants. They say, yeah, but we can do it. We can kill them because God says we could. So I think the context is clearly that the report is true. And again, this is context. If this is part of the problem, this is part of the modernist problem of modernist Christians imposing this rationalistic, paradigm on interpreting the Bible, because it's really dangerous to tear apart words like you put them under a microscope, because there's all kinds of exegetical fallacies, and even D.A. Carson has written a whole book on exegetical fallacies that Christians do, where you analyze a single word and you're analyzing it like it's scientific. And there's some value, of course, there's some value to the lexical meaning of a word, but it's really not as much as we think there is, because the context and the sentence is the primary, in terms of linguistic interpretation. The context and the sentence is actually of more primary value than the word is. We tend to think, well, break it down. Paragraph, sentence, word, right? No, that's the primary meaning is the sentence, because it's the sentence that brings the context to the individual words, which is why you can have the same exact word being figurative in one sentence and not figurative in another. And the only way you know that is because of the whole sentence, not the word. So this is why it's dangerous to just focus on, oh, well, the word could mean slander in another context. Yeah, but if you read the context here, clearly Joshua and Caleb are agreeing with them. So that this is another one of these elements where we need to read the genre of the literature and the context as of higher priority than the lexical meaning of the words. And I think that bears itself up on in the most proper hermeneutic.
Yeah, that's very well put. And I was reading through Numbers, and there was another part where I think there was some laws of purification, and there was different things that had to be done, and it was very you look at it and it seems very religious in the modern sense, and you have to do this. If you touch someone, you have to go outside the camps, and you have to do all this stuff, and it's with the paradigm of understanding that maybe there was like a genetic contamination going on. It really opens your eyes to like, oh, there's probably a good reason God wanted to go or wanted the Israelites to really be very serious about this stuff of if you touch something or do something in the way that can potentially harm you or others with sort of, I guess, a tainted bloodline, if you will. It just kind of blew my mind because I was like, I never saw it that way. So I'm sure there's a lot of them, a lot of gems like that in the Old Testament, especially, that we just haven't dug up yet. But shifting a little bit, I know you're not much of a prophecy guy, but I do want to bring up, because we do live in some very interesting times today. And part of Canary Cry Radio, we discuss transhumanism, technocracy, scientism, and the pursuit of godhood, right? Which is sort of a theme that you tackle as well. But Jesus did tell us that as in the days of Noah, so it shall be in the coming of the Son of Man. And I feel like the first century audience there that actually heard those words spoken by Jesus kind of knew, like, we're talking about the sons of God mating with human women, the Nephilim. But then after post-flood, because Noah lived 350 years after the flood, we're talking about, Nimrod, Gibborim, and the Tower of Babel and things like that. So what do you think, if anything, is happening now that could reflect on some of the things that may have been happening back in Noah's day?
Yeah, I try to keep up a little bit with some of that material, and yeah, you're right. I'm more interested right now in focusing on understanding the ancient context and getting that storyline down. And of course, until I finish my novels, I'm focusing on that. Right. How does it apply to the modern day and to the future prophecy? I do have some different ideas about prophecy anyway, but I actually find a lot of the material that I've read to be actually fascinating and interesting and worthy of, and it's causing me to think about things. And so I'm open, is what I'm saying. And I do think, some of these claims, like, the whole, I've done documentaries myself on stem cell research and, the hybridization and such. And I definitely see the incredible dangers going on there. And I do see in the ancient text this strict emphasis on, after their own kind. This wasn't an there's another case. That's not anti-evolution. It's not talking, it's basically talking, there's something about separation that's going throughout all the text. God separating the land from the water, separating male from female, keeping the separation of the species and all that kind of stuff. It's this stress on holiness and separation, and that's why the heavenly-earthly divide being shattered by having angels uniting with humans is a violation of that. I actually consider that to be the case, and I do respect a lot of the points that people are bringing up. That, well, what we're doing today is seems to be an apparent violation of that, separation kind of mindset, Right. And so I do find a lot of that interesting. Where I take my final stand on it, I'm not sure, because I haven't had enough to really study it. But I think that there's a lot to that. There's a lot to the dangers of this, of splicing in genes of horses or cows or spiders with humans in order to get these special traits, and they're actually getting closer and closer to being able to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that there is a lesson for today in the ancient text, and I even in my novel series, I try to bring some of that genetic manipulation into that text so that people who do actually believe that there's a end times Nephilim scenario would actually really appreciate the stories, because I think that there's enough in there for them to draw from as well, because I think that theologically there is a connection.
Right.
Is there one literally in terms of what's going to happen in the prophecy? I don't know. I don't suspect so, but I still do think that mankind is evil, and man will come up with all kinds of evil ways to try to hurt, control, and destroy other people. And so I'm on the side of the guys who are warning us that all this genetic manipulation that's going on today is a reflection of the violation of the genetic separation in the ancient world. I'm on their side theologically.
Right.
Yeah, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I actually think because what's happened to me recently, and I recently did my first public speaking a week and a half ago, and it was a lot of fun to put together a PowerPoint and things like that. But what I'm discovering is, as I look more at what we're doing today and where we're headed, as far as some of these guys who are transhumanists, pro, post-human sort of, all these views that they have about more outlandish stuff, like, uploading your consciousness onto a computer and all this stuff. Yeah. When you look at that, it actually has pointed me back to the ancient times, to, where mythologies come from. Because I feel like you get a better grasp of what's going on today if you get a better grasp of what may have been going on in the past. So is there any evidence that you find in the ancient texts, not just the Bible, but all the other ancient texts that we have available, and a lot of them that we've that have come to surface in the last century? It hasn't really been that long since we've uncovered some of these, but do you see any evidence of some kind of ancient technology that is part of maybe not technology in the sense that we would understand it, of electricity and batteries and I don't know, just gas, and things exploding. Yeah. But maybe in a different sense, a different way that they were able to harness energy and maybe use that to create portals and things like. I mean, I'm getting pretty speculative here, sure. but is there any evidence of that you found in your research, and also how did that influence the Chronicles of Nephilim? Yeah, well, here my basic interpretation is I do believe that generally in the Enochian interpretation of the Watchers, and what that is I'm sure most of your listeners already know, is that there's a famous book of First Enoch that all throughout church history has garnered great respect and belief from the church. So it has a lot of respect. It's not considered scripture, but it's nevertheless quoted and paraphrased within scripture, which means that the scripture uses it as a reference. So therefore, there's got to be legitimacy to it if that's the case, right. And so because of that, I place a lot of trust in it. But I don't think it's I don't think it's ultimately true like the Bible is. But in that text, it does talk about how these Watchers who fell to earth, and they were the ones that taught occultic secrets to mankind. I do believe that there's a possibility there, and it makes sense to me that if these sons of God, if these heavenly beings came to earth, well, their knowledge would be so superior to ours that they would probably have the ability to bring in a primitive form of science as we know it, and even engage in some genetic experimentation. I actually believe that that's entirely possible, and it may have actually occurred. How they did it, I don't know, but I think it's definitely a possibility, because why couldn't they? If they were revealing all these kind of dark secrets, why couldn't they reveal knowledge that's ahead of its time? Because they would be way far ahead of their time anyway. Right. And, and I think that that's important because, we know that there's this whole huge subculture, and it's growing in the secular atheistic worldview that believes that, religion is ancient man's ignorant reaction to ancient astronauts and ancient aliens visiting. Right. And now, of course, I mean, it's a growing field where even scientists are starting to believe this baloney. Right. And it's just so amazing. I mean, I remember back in the 70s when I read Chariots of the Gods. I read that when it first came out in the 70s. I was a young kid, and that stuff, it was just goofy, but it was fun and fascinating. And now
respectable scientists and academics are actually believing that stuff. And and they say Christians believe fairy tales. Good grief! But anyway, the point here is that nevertheless, it is one of their ways of trying to cope with some of these apparently, advanced forms of technology or operations. Now, I'm actually in the camp of Chris White. Have you
Yes.
seen his material?
Yes, of course.
I'm in his camp where he basically deconstructs ancient aliens, and he really does show that a lot of what we think is how they could never have done this, they actually could. We could build the pyramids, and there literally is a rock huger than the trilithons in Baalbek that was moved in the 17th century.
Right.
However, we don't know how they did it, which means that we did lose their understanding. We had to, spend many years trying to figure this out. And I do think that they probably had a lot more, I don't know that they had, yeah. And I don't know if the Baghdad battery is real. I doubt some of that stuff, but I still think that it's possible that they had much more advancement of technology than we may realize.
Right.
So I'm okay with that stuff, but I do think a lot of the premier examples have been debunked pretty satisfactorily to my mindset. But I still think that we sell the ancients short. And again, this comes back to our modernist, basically it's cultural imperialism.
Right.
We think, and this comes from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had a prejudiced view that interpreted religion was ignorant, therefore whatever ancient man believed came from ignorant mindset, and science was the great freer of knowledge and freedom of man. Therefore, anything before us was called the Dark Ages. And it's this whole bigoted, prejudiced presuppositions that have no foundation, but we think that way, so we've adopted that even implicitly, even as Christians who rejects the Enlightenment. We still picked up a lot of that thinking, and we tend to look upon the ancients as if they are a lot stupider than they are. And this is where a lot of the biblical criticism is just so ridiculous to me in my mindset, because these guys are tearing apart the Bible, trying to say, oh, look at all this redactor contradicts himself and this and that, and therefore as if these guys were idiots and they didn't know that they were putting together sentences that apparently looked contradictory. Well, maybe they're not so stupid, and there's a poetic or imaginative reason why they're doing it, and let's figure out what that is,
Right.
So yeah, this kind of stuff goes on all the time, and it's sort of like the more you get into the ancient mindset, the more you really start to see how stupid we are. No, I'm serious, and it's just like, because we are so ignorant and so so imperialistic with our own mindset that we can't see through another person's eyes. And so it's really quite a fascinating journey.
Yeah, and I think in part 2 of Age of Deceit that I'm working on now, I'm really looking at science and technology and where it's headed and stuff. And I know Tom Horn's sort of the leading expert on transhumanism, and I haven't had a chance to look at his new documentary that he did on that. But when I brought up ancient technology, I apologize for not being a little bit more specific, because I too believe, as far as Chris White, I think he did a good job showing, just debunking all that stuff, the ridiculousness of a lot of the things that the ancient astronaut theories hold on a lot of the megalithic sites and things of that nature. But when I was saying ancient technology, what I was more referring to was, I guess, to me, it's almost like when I say ancient technology, it's synonymous to magic or enchantments or something more fantastic than we might think, because when I looked at some of the things and how it came down, it seems like, and I traverse in the looking at secret societies and things like that, and I know that's not your thing, but you do find that when in the occult, they look at someone like Cain, for example, as the forgotten father, and he's the one that received sacred knowledge somehow, and that sacred knowledge was passed down, and in the secret circles and blah blah blah. So there's sort of this and what I find interesting is that science, the pursuit of modern science, even if it is materialistic, in its foundation, is the same. It's the same thing. It's the same goal as what was the primal lie, is what I call it. that that the serpent gives in Genesis 3. And so, I guess it's more along those lines. And perhaps the reason why I wanted to relate it to the Tower of Babel is because, something happened at Babel and God was like, no, that's not going to happen,
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what are your thoughts
you
on
know
that?
what? I actually do agree with you on that, and I do think that there is some kind of a theme, a meme, a thread, a connection, a spiritual connection that does go to these modern day occultic practices, and there's no surprise that they're connected back to Cain and of course Lucifer even. Like, yeah, they worship. And we're not talking about Satanists. We're talking about people who dedicate their. Wait, who's the famous guy who dedicated his book to Lucifer? My point was that I do believe there's a connection there, and here's something that my novel series create. I bring a novel interpretation, and what it is this. I say, what if, like in the ancient world, in the Chronicles of Nephilim, I bring this twist, and I say, what if in the ancient world, all the different cities of Mesopotamia, for example, had different gods that they worshipped.
Right.
And these gods were part of a pantheon. And they also had a whole theory of how the pantheon worked together as a bureaucracy and all this. And I thought, what if the gods of the ancient world, well, actually, let me say one more thing. In the Old Testament, there are several passages. Not only does God talk about the sons of God as Elohim or as gods at time, and these fallen ones are also those gods, but there are passages where God indicates, this is another one of my sloughing off of my modernist Christian evangelicalism, that interpretation then that thinks the Bible only says there's just one God and everything else are non-existent, so they're all fantasies. Well, as I read the text in their ancient mindset, I'm starting to see more realistically that, yes, I believe that there's one living God. But the Bible talks about other gods in a much more realistic way than we do. We just assume that they're all fake.
It's all superstition.
It's all superstition because that's our modern mindset.
Right.
But if you read the text in its context, I don't think that comes across that way. For example, there are several passages where it indicates, not only are there passages that talk about goat demons in the desert and all this kind of stuff, that is really wild, and we could, there's a lot of theological connection there. But there are passages that talk about, like in Deuteronomy and Numbers, where it says that, for instance, that Moses is talking, and he says that the gods to which these pagans sacrifice are demons. All right. And we also know that even in the New Testament, there's references like that where Paul says that, these pagan gods are demons. Right.
Right.
And so there's this sense that there's a demonic reality going on behind these pagan gods. Right. And, that's not to say that they're all that way, but nonetheless, that there's a spiritual reality behind these gods. What is that? So I said, what if the gods of the ancient world were real beings with supernatural powers, just like how we hear about their myths and stories, okay? But it's not that they were these real gods, but they were these fallen watchers who were supernatural, that we believe are supernatural, and they were masquerading as gods in order to draw away worship from the living God unto themselves. So they took on the identities of these pantheons, and they created all these religions, all this kind of stuff, and that's what man was worshiping. And that's the premise of Chronicles of the Nephilim, because you see these gods as real beings, and they're called gods because that's how people see them. And yeah, they're not like the living God, but they are a kind of God that people worship with supernatural powers, right? And so you see in Chronicles of the Nephilim, the gods of the pantheon are real beings, and they're interacting. They've got their own plans, and they're trying to do things. And so what I'm doing is I'm sort of integrating in. I'm doing what the Bible does, actually. I'm telling what I think is the true theological storyline. I use fantasy, and I take some imaginative liberties, and but I'm trying to explain the truth, spiritual reality behind the pagan religions as well as the Christian religion. How do they all work? How did these people have different beliefs than what we have, right? And I sort of tell a story that explains where their myths came from spiritually, and that's one of the goals of that. And so in the course of doing that, I actually bring in a lot of biblical characters such as Leviathan and Rahab, that if you study them, you realize that these also are ancient Near Eastern common mythological creatures, like, for instance, Leviathan or Rahab. They are sea dragons. Leviathan has many heads. In the Bible, in the book of Psalms, it says he has many heads, and which just happens to be 7 heads of Leviathan that we read about in Canaan. So everybody used this notion of Leviathan or the sea dragon, and they all used it in the same way. They didn't use it as if it was literally true, but they used it as a theological expression of chaos. So when they wanted to say that their God pushed back the chaos of the world to create the order that is their religious system, right? They would say that the God conquered the sea dragon. Well, guess what? Yes, Genesis 1 has complete absence of that. Well, not complete absence. He is described, the sea dragon is described as one of the creatures of the deep. But in other chapters in the Psalms, there is the description of God conquering the sea dragon to establish his power and authority and his covenant. So it's a covenantal language that uses the sea dragon as a theological theme. So, and all the ancient Near Eastern language cultures did this. So what I do in the Chronicles of the Nephilim is I do what the Bible does, because if you look up in your concordance, you read the passages on Leviathan, whether it's in Job or in Deuteronomy or what have you, you'll see that, for instance, in Numbers or Deuteronomy, where it talks about, I think it's Moses' song, the song of Moses after they crossed the Red Sea and out of the Exodus, and it talks about the historical event of the crossing of the Red Sea, but it uses a lot of mythopoetic language of the sea dragon, right? And so does that mean the Bible's mythological and not historical? No, it's not either or. It's actually talking about a historical event, but using mythopoetic or poetic language to communicate the theological truth. What's the theological truth? The truth is, when God was bringing his people out of Egypt into the promised land, getting ready to prepare them, he was suppressing the chaos of the pagan world around them, and he was preparing the land for him to establish his covenantal order of Israel. And so therefore it describes God, crushing the heads of Leviathan, right? That's the whole point of what's going on. So I bring that stuff into the Chronicles of the Nephilim, and I do the same thing that the Bible does, only you're seeing it literally happening. So that's one of the ways that I do that. But I think I got off on a tangent that was
That's okay. Tangents are great. Those are expected and revered on this show. So
yeah,
no problem.
But yeah, so this the ancient technology or the ancient revelation, I do believe that the Bible, that kind of stuff was going on, and the Enochian version is that the fallen sons of God actually revealed occultic knowledge to mankind. And now I don't think that it's all entirely true, because it talks about they showed the women makeup.
Right.
Well, I don't think makeup's evil. Okay. So, but I do know that when the writers of the book of Enoch were probably around the time of the Maccabees, and in that time period, the Jewish world was very Hellenized, and so they were trying to make another separation and saying, all this, they were stressing holiness. And so I think that there's this notion of, wanting to separate themselves. And so they refer to all kinds of stuff that was going on in their time period and stuff. So I do think that there's some exaggeration in Enoch, but I think the principle's still the same that happened. And that is, they revealed these occultic secrets, which probably was included some kind of genetic crossbreeding. How they did it, who has any idea? I have no idea.
Right.
I simply don't.
Yeah, and you bring up something interesting with what was the last you had mentioned something?
I don't believe.
Oh, the makeup. Okay. I actually, I know that verse in Enoch, I think it's chapter 8, where it goes through the names of the fallen angels, the watchers, and what they taught. Yeah. And you bring up the interesting point, because when I looked at that, I hadn't considered what you just mentioned there, but it seemed to me that to make sense in some regard, because, you think about the sons of God who came down in Genesis 6, and they were tempted because, the women were beautiful. it seems like maybe they were dressing them up beforehand, and then, they were tempted because they were dressed up, in the way that the fallen angels wanted them to look and stuff. But at the same time, what's more compelling for me is that when you look at the line of Cain and you get to Lamech, and this is not the same Lamech from the Messianic line, but Lamech had 2 wives, and those 2 wives, I don't have it in front of me, but their names basically reflected, objectifying, yourself. So objectifying the female. And so it kind of stems back, and I kind of think, well, it's possible, that these watchers taught makeup, and not to say makeup is evil, but it was just a way to sort of, make the mindset of man very man-centered and not so godly. Sure. And of course, that's the plan of the fallen one to begin with. But, a couple more quick questions here, because I'm skimming through your book, and I haven't been able to read the whole thing, but you brought up an interesting thing that we've touched on a little bit, but if you can dive into a little more, the use of the language in the ancient text, and you brought up sarcasm and, like humor and things like that. And I believe we miss a lot of that in, just our modern rendering and maybe even some in the translation. But what have you found as far as sarcasm? I feel like that's a hard one to detect if you don't really know the context of where the ancient Near East writers were coming from. So can you kind of give us a little insight on that and perhaps a couple examples?
Yeah. Well, again, it's funny. This is another example of our cultural imperialism, of modernism, when we think that we're such a sarcastic, cynical culture, right? And we think that that's a form of sophistication, right? But because really that's what it is, and there is a sense of where it is a sophistication, but really a lot of sarcasm degenerates into cynicism, which really isn't sophistication.
Right.
It's just hopelessness, despair, and meaninglessness, and they don't recognize it. But anyway, we tend to think that, ancient world didn't have our kind of humor because they weren't as sophisticated as we were. So for us to so it's like if you read a book or watch a movie where you see ancient man and they crack a sarcastic joke and you're going, oh, that seems too modern. That's not ancient. Well, no, you dummy. They had sarcasm too. All you have to do is read any of the Greek plays, and Clouds by Aristophanes, and they're full of sarcasm, right? So sarcasm was. Look, I've studied the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there's sarcasm in Gilgamesh. So we're not as sophisticated as we think we are, and they're a lot more sophisticated than we thought they were. But some of the examples in the Bible, a lot of where the sarcasm comes actually is, and this is another thing that again does not hit our evangelical minds with a very with happiness. And that is that these ancient worlds, and actually I get back to Nimrod. I think that's a good case of it. But the names, a lot of times the names of people, places, and gods that are referred to in the scripture are actually thought by some scholars, and they make some very strong arguments that prove that the names are not the literal names because they're sort of polemically derived names, and sometimes it's explicit, like in the case of Babel, right, where it says it was called Babylon, which means gateway of the gods,
right?
But God, the whole thing of Babel is a very mocking text. It's a wonderful study of mockery and sarcasm, because it talks about how man thinks he's so great that he's going to build a tower to the heavens. Well, it again, the ancient context doesn't mean he's trying to build a super high tower, but what it does mean is it's the notion of pride in thinking they can build a tower that has a religious ability to connect heaven and earth spiritually. So it's actually got an occultic meaning behind it.
Right.
But there's still that, again, it's a figurative way of saying we're becoming spiritually big and proud, is we're building a tower to the heavens. And then God says, well, let me go down and see what they're doing. Well, that's sarcasm. It's like saying, you think they're so tall, well, I think I'll step down and see where they're at, But the name Babel, it says that it was, they called the place Babel, which means confusion, because that's where the confusion of tongues happened, because God said, okay, you're going to try to be unified in evil. Well, I'm going to split you apart and give you different tongues. And that's what spread man up across the earth, right? And so it calls it Babel. So the play on words is gateway of the gods, Babylon, to confusion of tongues, which is Babel. And that's a very derogatory way. The Jews called it Babel, but I don't think that's what they called it, was Babel.
Right.
And guess what? The name Nimrod actually mean, and I've done a study on this because Nimrod shows up in my book, Abraham Allegiant, the new book, and I follow the sort of the ancient Jewish traditional interpretation of that, which I don't necessarily, I don't know that it's true or not, but it's a tradition that I respect, and it's a very good story, and that is that Nimrod did build the Tower of Babel, and et cetera, and actually he was around during the time of Abraham, and Abraham actually interacted with him. And so I tell that story in my Abraham Allegiant as well. But if you look at the biblical text, though, the word Nimrod, and you study the passage, and you find that Nimrod probably means to rebel.
Right.
And, who calls themselves by a negative name? Villains don't call themselves by villains' names, right?
Right.
So, and scholars have done a study on that indicates, if you look at that section of Babel and it talks about Nimrod, or if you look at the section on Nimrod where it talks about how he was, the start of his kingdom was, I don't have the text with me. Let me find it. That's Genesis. What was that? 11.
I think it's 11, yeah.
Or no, actually, Genesis 10 is what it talks about, Nimrod. And, it says, there's all kinds of stuff we can go into the passage, but basically it says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from there he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Well, if you look at it, all those cities happen to be the key cities of the historical progression of history from that lasts about 1,000 years. Babel was first the early leading of culture, and then Erech, and then Akkad. But Akkad and then Nineveh didn't come till way later, and Assyria didn't come till way later. Assyria, he didn't start all those at the same time. But if you look at it, Assyria, from Babel to Erech to Akkad to Assyria, the kingdom of Akkad to the kingdom of Assyria to Nineveh, that's about 1,000 years. So he obviously didn't live 1,000 years. So some scholars have shown that basically Nimrod is sort of a archetypal villain, which, during the time of the exile, Babylon was considered the ultimate enemy of evil. And so if they wanted to link that historically, that's what they were doing. And they were saying that, and Nimrod was rebel, and Nimrod is the mighty hunter before the Lord. And that was in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, all the kings were usually depicted as mighty hunters, holding the two lions on each hand, and this kind of, it was so in other words, this is a generic reference to the kingdom of Mesopotamia as being a rebellious entity against God. And the whole history of it's sort of a symbolic synopsis of the history of Mesopotamia. Now, I'm not saying this is the absolute interpretation. I may be wrong, but a lot of scholars have shown that this is probably the case. So, but this is not the only place where they name Nimrod as to rebel, and therefore they're saying basically Babylon and ancient Mesopotamia were wayward against God and they're evil. And the kings tried to, and you look at Mesopotamia and they have all these towers and all these cities and they're all pagans. And it's kind of linking that to this storyline of evil. But that's not the only place. If you look at places like in some of the Old Testament texts, it talks about Beelzebul. And there's different there's different ways of spelling it. Well, in the ancient Canaanite texts, it's spelled differently, and it's spelled to mean that it means prince or lord, Beelzebul. But in the Book of Kings, it says Beelzebub, and what they think is they took, the Hebrew is a consonantal language, and so was Ugaritic, and so was Canaanite language, and they took the consonants of Beelzebul, and they put the What's the opposite of consonants?
I'm not a very good language scholar.
Vowels.
Vowels.
They took the vowels of the word Bosheth, which means shame, and they put those vowels in it so that it comes out Beelzebub. Beelzebub. All right? So they're mocking Beelzebub and calling it shameful. See what I'm saying? So there's a very sarcastic, and they did that with the name Jezebel. The word Jezebel, if you look at the ancient text entire, the reference to Jezebel is Itzabal, like Isabel. But they call him Jezebel, and that actually word means, it actually brings a play in on the word dung. You know?
Right.
Jezebel will be in the field of dung. So they were calling Isabel Jezebel. So the way that Hebrews even make references to kings is not the literal names, but oftentimes they are sarcastic or polemical references to, as well as to gods and to kings that are pagan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it seems like if we keep that in mind, and we actually, if there is a translation that might come along in the future that sort of takes these things into account, there may be a lot of profanity
Yes.
in our modern interpretation of some of these things, like dung, for example.
Yeah.
Just one last question, and again, this is sort of, I have to go here just because this is where my mind is at, and looking at the future and where we're at now. But you really do seem to point out that there is obviously a spiritual element to this idea of perhaps science in a sense of, in an ancient sense. And it was very much, hand in hand, science as far as understanding the mechanical workings, but also the spiritual sort of undercurrent that connected all that together. And that has obviously sort of been separated in the last, 150, 200 years or so. But it seems like what I'm starting to find is that more and more people in the sciences are starting to talk about how they have to revisit this idea of a reductionist view. And they have to start incorporating some of these metaphysical possibilities as part of the scientific, still within the scientific construct. Yeah. And there's one man who's named Carter Phipps, he wrote a book called Evolutionaries: Unlocking the Spiritual and Cultural Potential of Science's Greatest Idea. And he basically said, we're witnessing the birth of an authentic new spiritual and philosophical worldview, and that this worldview was science-friendly and placed questions of human purpose and meaning fully in the context of the evolutionary cosmos, and he goes on. But it's just alarming to me that, the church in general doesn't really look at, we're already behind, right? We're already sort of playing catch-up on a lot of issues. Yeah. And here we are, there's a leading biologist saying, the 10 problems with materialism, and things like that. They're starting to understand and get the idea, like, hey, this materialistic reductionist view is kind of bankrupt. There's not really an answer there. Yes. You have to incorporate these other things. And so my concern, I guess, is that the modern church, we've done a great job answering to these atheistic sort of worldviews, but as they start moving into the spiritual realm, a lot of it is sort of new agey. Yeah. And sort of pantheistic, if you will. But do you see the possibility of books like yours and your work being able to address some of these things as far as, I don't know exactly how it might happen, but do you think that your work of fiction can draw interests and actually, how do you actually incorporate or inspire your readers to pursue, this sort of understanding of scripture and not be afraid of some of these things coming down the pike? Yes, very good question. And isn't it interesting how once mankind starts to recognize maybe materialism isn't right and there is a spiritual side to science, strange how they don't end up turning back to Christianity, but they come up with a monistic or Eastern worldview that has to be in other words, any religion but the truth, any religion but Christianity. And that's the same case with philosophy and history and everything. They always, when they start to admit that maybe they're part wrong, they never return to maybe Christianity's right. It's always another godless religion because that's the nature of man. They're sinful and such. So I expect that. But you know what? It's interesting you say that, because I actually do
believe, as much as my books are part of the fantasy genre, and they're novels, and they're written like watching a movie, because that's my intent. Is I want them to be entertaining,
Right.
and I just can't be bored. I can't stand being bored, so I write them to be like entertaining, and some, you're watching it like you're reading it like you're watching a movie. Okay, but ironically, this is the stuff that people love to read. I'm selling far more books of that than I am of my other books, which are more theological, that try to explain it all theologically from the Bible. So I actually do believe that, like I was saying earlier, the Bible communicates theological truth mostly through story, and so I'm going to do that. And people are going to pick it up osmotically or through osmosis. The more that they read the worldview put through an entertaining lens, I actually think it's going to help them to see the world more correctly in terms of spiritually and scientifically unified, but under a Christian worldview. So, for example, I make the claim that my novel series is the antidote to the ancient aliens worldview. Well, I don't actually attack it in any way at all. But,
Right.
And in a sense, I don't even address it, and I don't address it in my appendixes either. In my appendixes, that's another, well, I'll get to that in a second. But basically, my point but the fact is I explain the ancient wisdom and the ancient notion of religions. I give my explanation of these beings that have visited the planet. I give it the explanation as being, angels and as spiritual beings. And that's exactly what the ancient astronauts are trying to debunk or trying to get rid of. Well, I do the opposite. I tell the stories that support the spiritual interpretation, and it makes sense, and it's because it's rich and biblical and theological. I bring in a lot of ancient historical research. I bring a lot of, nothing that happens in any of my novels is completely made up by me. I'm not very original. I've just read a lot of ancient texts and brought in their ideas and integrated it all together under the lordship of Aslan. In other words, my fantasy is ultimately under the lordship of the Bible, of God in the Bible. So I use all these ancient pagan mythologies, which is what the Bible does. I use the mythologies and I redefine them within my new context. Well, that's what everybody does, but we just don't know it. So yes, I've decided that that's the most effective means for me, at least, to really affect the world. But I'm a right brain, left brain person, because I love the intellectual stuff. And one of the things I always loved about Michael Crichton was his novels. He'd tell these great stories, and at the end he'd have appendix explaining the real science behind the fiction, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I decided I'm going to do that with mine only. I'm going to explain the real biblical and historical research behind the fiction in my novels. And so all of my books have sometimes as much as 70 to 100 pages of appendixes of the theological, historical, and biblical backgrounds to all the stuff that I'm writing, because I'm not, like I said, I'm not making up a lot of it. My talent is in being able to cull from all the different sources and put it all together and make it work. And that's what my talent is. And so in a way, my novels are sort of have a little bit for the left brain, a little bit for the right brain. So I think that it can appeal to many different approaches, But the bottom line is if you don't tell a great story, in fact, N.T. Wright has said this in quoting some other people, where he says, basically the person who tells the best story is the one who wins the culture, and that's what I want to do, is tell great stories, but have them rooted in strong biblical theology. And that's what I do. But yet, interestingly, I'm not one of those writers who tries to make things into spiritual lessons and, make it a Christian novel. I don't really do that. I just look, God's in my story because I'm taking it from the Bible. Okay, but I'm not trying to impose my Christian message on it. I'm just telling a story that's germane and sticks to the original material and the original tradition and heritage that it comes from. So that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah, that's great, and you sort of led me into the next question that I had, which is kind of a wrap up. But do you actually have a gospel narrative or some sort of, I guess, your take for a redemption type character, and that whole part? Obviously the New Testament theology is worked into the storyline. I actually do, but it's very germane to it.
And it's basically, the overarching thread of the series is the war of the seed of the serpent against the seed of Eve. And that goes back to the proto-evangelion, which is in Genesis 3, where God says, I will put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And I believe that really was, but also, don't forget, the Apostle Paul, way, way later in the book of Galatians, he says, he's referring to Abraham's promise, but the point is God said, I will give this land to your seed. Well, he says that seed is singular, not plural. The seed is Christ. Well, technically it isn't. It is plural, but God is bringing a double meaning to the text when he says, when God was promising to the seed, he was promising that he would give the inheritance of all things to Christ. And then if we are in Christ, we will inherit, see?
Right.
And so I take that back further and say, well, then when he's saying the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, there's a hint of the messianic promise. So my whole storyline is that the seed, these two seed of peoples that are based on faith or religion, but also there's some genetic element to it, and how that interplays, it's not always clear, but it's basically the storyline of these two fighting for power and control, and but that seed that God promises is not always referred to in the plural as in the people of God, but as a hint that there's a coming king. But interestingly, I think that Old Testament wise, most of that is referring to David, the King David, and how ultimately the King David would clear the land. But then King David is the ultimate archetype that points to Christ. So Christ does ultimately, he is the ultimate fulfillment. But how much I bring into the New Testament, I bring in as much as the Old Testament does, which is not a lot. It's all hinted at and referenced. It's messianic, but it's not always clear. However, I have to pull back and have a caveat there, because I do bring in the Son of Man in the book in the Enoch Primordial. I won't go into the details, but there is, as we know, in the Old Testament, there are references to the Son of Man and Daniel coming up to the Ancient of Days, and I think that that's a reference to Christ, actually, and Christ in heaven and such. And so I do have the Son of Man. I don't call him Jesus, but I call him the Son of Man like the Old Testament does. But he's clearly Christ. And in the heavenly council, in the divine council in heaven, which is we read about in Job. This isn't I didn't make this up. This is in Job. This is in the Bible. God has a heavenly council with all of his sons of God, and the Son of Man is there as well. And it's a legal courtroom, actually. And I in the book, in my Enoch, my Primordial, I actually have a court case going on where the Satan, or the adversary, engages in a lawsuit against God by saying God's covenant with Adam is unjust in all these 5 points. And the 5 points follow the points of the ancient Near Eastern Hittite covenant treaty, which I think is in the Old Testament. And Satan, basically, he just makes all these arguments against God. And so Enoch and the Son of Man are the defense attorneys, and they counter all the arguments of the Satan. And so I do have I actually, now that I'm remembering this as we're talking, and I do actually bring a little bit of of Christ into the story, but it's very veiled in Old Testament terms, because I try to stick as close to the original context, because I think that the unveiling of Christ was sequential. It was not total. It was what do they call it? I can't remember the theological term, but basically it means over time God reveals more of his Messiah, so that in the olden days they didn't know as much about Messiah as they do closer to the time of Christ. And then of course once Christ comes, a lot of obscure, ambiguous passages become clear, but they weren't clear back then. Right. And so I try to be true to that context, which makes it kind of fascinating reading.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, where can people check out your books and all the stuff that you got going on?
Thank you. I should have been plugging it throughout the interview.
It's okay.
But Amazon.com, it's exclusively at Amazon. You can buy it on Kindle for real cheap, or buy the paperback books. But there's something very cool that I offer people. Go to the website, chroniclesofthenephilim.com, and you will find a whole bunch of very cool free stuff. I have a bunch of book trailers that are cool. I've got me on video explaining some of the concepts. I've got a bunch of artwork from each of the books that is really cool, and I explain some of the characters of the novels. If you want to introduce yourselves, I cast each of the novels like they were movies, so I have pictures of all the characters and descriptions of them, and a bunch of artwork and a bunch of free articles related to the theology of the books that are some of my favorite articles by scholars. So there's a lot of free material at the website chroniclesofthenephilim.com if you want to kind of get acquainted with it before you buy the novels, or once you read the novels, you want to go back to the website and see all the visuals that help sort of fill out the storyline.
Very cool. And do you have any plans or aspirations to make this into a TV series or a movie or something?
I would love to, but I'm realistic, and these are huge. They would be $150 million movies, and Hollywood doesn't really do that unless you're Harry Potter or Twilight. So here's the goal. If I can sell 1 million copies of my books, then yes, I have a chance of. But until that point in time, no, I don't suspect it's going to be made into movies. And the other downside of it is, the bummer is, as some of your listeners may already know, there is a movie about Noah being made right now by Darren Aronofsky. And I actually, on my blog, my movie blog, which you can access through Chronicles of the Nephilim, I did a complete analysis and deconstruction of the script for the movie, because the movie's not out, but I got a hold of the script, early script, and so I critiqued it from a biblical perspective. And sadly, it's going to be more about environmentalism and the false god of Gaia and environment than it is about the Bible. And so, but the point is once that movie's made, which is like $100 million movie, they're not going to make another movie about Noah in a long time, so I'm not going to have a chance. However, my book Enoch could be made into a movie because it's before Noah, and it's really cool. It's all about Enoch as a giant killer. So I think that there is potential. I just have to sell 1 million copies. So everybody go out and buy it and tell your friends. Yes, definitely go check out Brian's work. And well, thank you, Brian, so much for having this conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. I think it's great what you're doing, just taking these topics and making it into something that is a great story, but also something that your young people can consume. And obviously it sounds like a great read. I haven't actually been able to read them myself, but I'm definitely, after this conversation, I'm going to go get them as soon as possible. So thanks so much. I appreciate it. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Can you hear me?
Yo,
what's up?
not much. Let me move locations real quick. Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? You can hear me now.
We can hear you now.
I can actually hear you now. I think I have my instruments are tuned.
Yeah, you rule the air now.
Yeah. Good. On the air. Okay, well, hey everybody. My name is Basil, and I used to be a co-host on Canary Cry Radio way back in 2013.
Well, you tried calling in while we were having the conversation with Brian Godawa.
Yes.
But that didn't go too well.
No, I had no idea what you guys were saying, but it sounded like you guys were doing great.
You couldn't hear anything that we were talking about, but it sounded great.
No, yeah, I was. If to give my position away a little bit, I was in an Applebee's, a friendly neighborhood Applebee's that I found.
Well, obviously, the sound of sizzling bacon is going to overpower anything that we talk about.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you over the neighborhood community and the sizzling platters as they came out, and I don't know, stuff, whatever else they have in there. But I'm glad I got back on the line, and I don't know. I mean, so you guys had a good conversation.
Yeah, it was a pretty good conversation. We'll let the audience decide.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'll read some angry emails later and see how you guys really did.
Yeah, we'll find out eventually, one way or another.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll just let everybody know that I am still alive. I'm freezing where I am. I'm out sitting on a crate. I've got my winter jacket on. There's some bird poop next to me. I've got some fingerless gloves, which is a bad choice. Next time I'm spring for the full fingered glove option. Let's see. There's a little bit of snow everywhere. I'm on a Wi-Fi. I found some Wi-Fi.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah.
How did you connect to the back onto the ether?
Right. I'm on the interwebs via, what is this? A Wi-Fi network called DARPA Van 1. So whatever DARPA is, thanks for the free internet, guys. That's really nice.
Maybe there's a drone nearby that provided.
I think that's it. Yep, there's some very slow-moving aircraft that have been circling above here for a while. All right, so you talked to Brian. He's a cool guy. What is he, from L.A.? He's a writer-director, is he not?
Yeah, he's a filmmaker,
I'm sure a lot of what I'm saying right now is being censored just automatically. Via my shared Wi-Fi network.
Via the DARPA drone that's hovering over your head that you don't see right now because they have cloaking technologies now.
Yeah.
But yeah. So what have you seen? What do you?
Okay. What do I see? Well,
not right in front of you because you already described the bird poop and stuff. I'm asking on this little excavation / travels, if you will.
Right.
Is there anything that our audience might find interesting that you've come across?
Right. Well, there's a train. If you can hear that. Can you hear that?
A little bit. I hear more wind.
Woo! That train is really close. That is a very close train, everyone. Oh, there's 2 trains. 2 trains. All right, here's some interesting stuff. I see 2 trains. One has a lot of flatbed train cars that are empty. I say about 150 empty flatbed train cars, which probably at one time held some drones or some UFOs or secret tank projects. And another train, I swear to you, I'm not lying to you right now, and there's another train with about 200 train cars of those oil ones, the ones that hold, fluids. And so I'm assuming that's either filled with nuclear waste or some sort of fuel for whatever was on those flatbeds.
I don't think I've laughed this hard on Canary.
No, so yeah, that's about it. For everyone else, just to keep it in the spirit of anonymity, I'm on a long trip, as you could have guessed, across the. I will let you guys in on at least a small portion of the locational secrets. On the lower 48 states. I'm somewhere within the continental United States, and going back and forth and doing lots of fun things. So I apologize to everybody that I haven't been around for Canary Cry Radio here for a while, but from what I hear and from the lack of hate mail, or at least the small diminished amount, I can tell that Gons is doing a great job keeping everybody on lockdown. Oh yeah, I meant to ask you, how was the Prophecy Forum?
It was good. It was definitely fun. It was a good time, but I think just going over my presentation, and I put the video out a few days ago, and last episode, I don't know if you heard it, but I ramble for a while, and plus I play the audio, but it's definitely it's kind of like it's a rush.
Yeah.
But when I look back at the tape and stuff, there's so many points where I'm like, oh, I should have did this better, or said this better, or made this point better. Or
absolutely. Well, I will tell you that I did watch the video.
Oh, okay.
And I'll say you did a really good job. And I'll say that, there were some parts where I was like, Gons, come on, man. No, I'm just kidding. No, that was great. I was really jealous. I kind of wish that I could have been around and done something for that. So I think just between you and me, Gons, that we should do some more live stuff because that looked like a ball.
Yeah, no, it was fun, and when we do our live stuff, it's going to be a fiasco. It's going to we're going to have lights moving around and people machines, in costumes and
laser machines.
Oh, laser machines and portable UFOs, and it's going to be just.
I've got a giant. I just came across a giant armadillo costume, so we could just work that in somewhere. I don't know, maybe do a Texas thing.
What? Okay. So
there's no explanation there. I didn't say I was in Texas.
A Texas thing.
I said we could do a Texas thing.
Oh, okay.
Are you serious? Okay. I'm not in Texas, freezing my butt off over here.
That's true. Yeah, the wind sounds pretty chilly there.
Yeah, I know you have a keen ear for temperature, for air temperature, and I've always admired that about you. I really feel like that's one of the gifts of the spirit that a lot.
Okay. Are you missing California at all?
I am. I want to come home very badly, but I'm on a mission, and I'm going to continue on.
Yeah, finish the mission first, and then maybe we'll let you back in.
So, all right. Well, I don't know. Maybe I've held you guys long enough, but I'm glad that you had a good conversation. All of you people out there, thanks for continuing to listen to Canary Cry Radio. Even with the devastating loss of me for a couple episodes, I know some of you are just so disappointed. No, but good job, Gons. Thanks for holding it down, man.
Yeah. We'll get back on it. And I did last episode. I did mention that we do plan on doing an episode on water and worship music, and some of those things are starting to line up a little bit. So hopefully you'll get back because the water episode is something that I'm looking forward to. That
one was my idea, just so everybody knows. Just if you're listening right now. When you listen to the water, unless it sucks, in that case it was Gons. He put the whole thing.
Well, maybe I'll make it suck now that you're trying to take all the credit for it. I'll be
great. This is how ministries fall, Gons. This is how they fall. Okay, well, I'm gonna. I should sign off here.
You should go get warm and
a couple of black Suburbans just pulled up, and I'm thinking I should go.
You're suspicious being out in the open on a computer.
Yeah,
chasing armadillos and running away from trains. So I'll let you.
Yeah, no, I don't get it. This isn't California, man. People don't get that sort of thing here. All right,
boy. Okay.
This is Basil, everybody. I'm still alive. Thank you for hanging in there. Make sure to tune back in next time to Canary Cry Radio. And until then, think outside the cage.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Canary Cry Radio. The show notes for this episode and many others are available at canarycryradio.com. Make sure to connect and like our Facebook page at facebook.com/canarycryradio. Follow us on Twitter at Canary Cry Radio. If you would like to share the show in video format, you can find us on YouTube by searching Canary Cry Radio. Review us on iTunes with 5 stars and give us a thumbs up on stumbleupon.com. We would like to thank those of you who have given us your support, prayers, and donations. If you would like to join us and support Canary Cry Radio financially, you could do so by visiting canarycryradio.com and clicking the support tab. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, remember to think outside the cage.